if you have a Bible, open it up. We are in the book of Acts if you're new to our church. It's about 3/4 of the way to the right. There are Bibles in the seats in front of you. If you don't already have one, you can find one there unless somebody has stolen it. Our term is giving it away. And the book of Acts, just about every chapter has a theme of sorts. It has a kind of a subject matter that chapter seems to be hitting. And the speech and the interaction that we're going to see in Acts 14 is very unique, particularly up to what we've seen now in the book of Acts. And what makes it unique is that the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, excuse me, that'll wake you up. Let me do that 2 or 3 more dozen times. Paul and Barnabas, in this case, are not giving a speech or a sermon, if you will, to a group of Jews and Gentiles that are also following the Judeo-Christian way, if you will. But they're talking to basically pagans. I love the word pagan. I don't know why I love the word pagan. It's just a great word. I like calling my friends pagans. So they're talking to just heathenism almost. So it's fascinating that we haven't seen this yet. And so Paul and Barnabas have to kind of alter the way they speak to this audience because they're so different than every other group that they have spoken to. And so the message in Acts 14 is less this announcement, for example, by Paul, that the long-awaited king that would come from the line of David is finally here. That the long-awaited Messiah that had been prophesied for hundreds and hundreds of years is here. That's not the message in chapter 14. Because they're talking to pagans. They're talking to people that do not have this odd concept of a single God that created everything that we see, including us, and that wants a relationship with us. That's not how they think. And so, really, what they're going to have to address is, to this group of people, that you're looking for life in all the wrong places. You're chasing after what Paul will refer to as vain things. The word really means idols. But I love that translation, vain things. They're things that promise to deliver life to us, but they don't. What is not unique in this chapter is the heavy persecution that Paul in particular receives for following Jesus. So if you have your Bible, we'll start in Acts chapter 14 and verse 1. In Iconium, they entered the synagogue of the Jews together and spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both Jews and Greeks. So again, they go to a synagogue first, which is what they always did. They share Jesus out of the Old Testament scriptures to show that he was in fact the Messiah. Many Jews in that synagogue, like we always find out, believe in Jesus as the Messiah, the long-awaited Messiah. And all of these synagogues, just a reminder if you haven't been here, these synagogues exist in these cities way outside of Israel because they've been dispersed from Israel for several hundred years. It's referred to as the diaspora, and there's tons of archaeological evidence for this and writings for this, historical writings outside the Bible, by the way. And so you have Jewish communities littered all over what we would call modern-day Turkey and Greece, these Jewish synagogues, and then Gentiles would join them and really give their life to following the Jewish God of the Old Testament, most of them becoming what were referred to as proselytes. So they would actually, these Gentiles would get circumcised and they would essentially kind of become Jewish, if you will. And so this audience of people that Paul is speaking to in this synagogue in Iconium are Jews and Gentiles, and they're believing. Verse 2, but the Jews who disbelieved stirred up the minds of other Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren. Now, this Iconium, this place, is roughly 90 miles southeast of the city of Antioch. You recall we looked at last week, this is generally referred to as the Apostle Paul's first missionary journey. There's 2 hub churches now. There's one in Jerusalem, obviously. There's a second hub church on that right side in the place called Antioch of Syria. Paul gets in a boat with Barnabas. They go to Cyprus first. They share the gospel there. Cyprus being the place where Barnabas is from, a very natural place. A Roman senator is on Cyprus. He gives his life to following Jesus. He more than likely gives them an introduction because he owns large estates up in Pisidian Antioch. So they sail to Perga, up over 100 miles up over the Tarsus Mountains to Pisidian Antioch. They share the gospel. They get roughed up like usual. Now he's traveled with Barnabas 90 miles or so southwest to this place called Iconium. And even though this place of Iconium is in the province of Iconium, it's remained largely Greek. What I mean by that is they have resisted the Roman influence on them and have tried to hold back kind of their Greek thinking. And again, I want to make sure, and I say this almost every week, because almost every week the passages say this. Paul always goes to the Jews first as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. Isaiah 49:6 makes it very clear. God would gather Israel back to himself, a renewed Israel, and then they would go reach the world. Paul is Jewish. Barnabas is Jewish. They're the ones taking the gospel out. We have this mindset, because almost every person in our church is a Gentile, that somehow God has turned his back on the Jewish people and now he's reaching Gentiles. That is so contrary to what Scripture teaches. Jews by the tens of thousands literally are coming to Jesus, both in Israel now and in the synagogues and the surrounding area. And they're the ones that are taking the gospel out beyond the land of Israel. And then we have these Jews who do not believe, and they stir up the other Gentiles to create a problem for Paul and Barnabas. Verse 3. Therefore, they spent, meaning Paul and Barnabas, a long time there, so that they're encouraging this church in Iconium, these new believers, teaching them. They spent a long time there speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord, who was testifying to the word of his grace. This is cool. This is Paul's gospel. It's not just doing the right thing. To Paul, the gospel is about a God who has pursued mankind for millennium in kindness to have deep love and relationship with us, granting that signs and wonders be done by their hands. Again, this is a very unique thing. That's why it's pointed out. It's pointed out because very rare in life and very rare in the Bible does God give signs and wonders abilities to a particular person to do a healing. We read these things like, like we read this morning where Paul heals a lame guy and we think, why has that never happened to you? Well, welcome to the club. God doesn't do this very often. He's very selective, and it's quite frankly his choice how he decides and when he decides to do this. Verse 5. Verse 4. But the people of the city were divided, and some sided with the Jews, and some sided with the apostles. Verse 5. And when an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat and to stone them, these are the ones that are against them, obviously, not the ones that believed in Jesus, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe, and the surrounding region, and there they continued to preach the gospel. Lystra, you can see on the map, is an additional roughly 18 miles southwest of Iconium. Derbe is another 55 miles below and kind of to the side of that as well. They're both in the province of a region referred to as Galatia, which you may be familiar with that term in the Bible, the Galatians, or Paul's letter to the Galatians. This is the region of Galatia. And Lystra lay right on the Imperial Road, the main Roman road between Iconium and Lyrandus. So it was a heavily, heavily traveled area. And just a side note, kind of a little historical comment. The people of Lystra, this town that they've entered into, were known as a kind of a backwater group of folks. They are the Arkansas, if you will, of this region. I don't know another way to say that. Everybody knows what I mean when I say that. If you're from Arkansas, you probably really know what I mean when I say that. Yeah. So think of Lystra as a little bit. Is there somebody here from? There's nobody here from Arkansas, is there?
Just Wayne.
Just Wayne. Wayne, you're not from Arkansas. He's way too sophisticated for that. By the grace of God, nobody from Arkansas will pull up this sermon and listen to it. So the story is going to play on this a little bit because they're kind of a gullible people. And they're easily swayed one way or another, and we'll see that. And so again, to remind you back to the beginning of what I said, for the first time, Paul and Barnabas are going to interact with just pure heathenism, if you will. And it's really cool to watch how they adapt their communication to these folks. They don't come at them the same way. Verse 8. At Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze on him and had seen that this guy had faith to be made well. Some of your translations might say faith to save him. That's not a good translation. It's not. This guy's not looking for salvation. He just wants his legs fixed. Does that make sense? He's laying there, he sees these kind of holy men come, and he just wants help with his legs. And Paul is cool with this. I mean, obviously Paul wants to introduce him to his God, but he is comfortable and more than happy to just love this guy where he's at. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, when he had fixed his gaze on him, he had seen him and had faith to be made well, and he said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet," which is neat. Paul is asking him, participate with God in this. This isn't just, you got to exercise an ounce of faith with God. Make a decision to trust God and stand up. And he leapt up and began to walk. Verse 11. When the crowd saw that Peter had done this, Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have become like men and have come down to us." And they began calling Barnabas Zeus, that's the Greek name for Jupiter, and Paul Hermes, the Greek name for Mercury, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds. Since they were speaking Lycaonian language, Paul and Barnabas can't understand what they're talking about. Most scholars believe that this is a Greek dialect. Obviously, Paul spoke Greek, he spoke Aramaic, he spoke Hebrew, but this is a dialect in Greek that Paul and Barnabas do not understand. So can you imagine this? They start to worship them because they heal. This guy gets healed through them, and they sense this hubbub, but I would love to see the movie of this, but they don't really know what it is. You wonder how long it took them to figure out that they were actually the objects of this worship. And there's a really fascinating piece of history here that, if we know the piece of history, makes this story make more sense. Zeus, as many of you know, was the supreme god of the Greek pantheon. And there's a legendary story, and archaeologists in Lystra found two inscriptions around the 3rd century AD, so a couple hundred years after our story this morning. And these inscriptions spoke about a tale whereby Zeus and Hermes decided to visit mankind. And they actually showed up at Lystra. This is all part of the Greek mythology and legend. Some of you may know the story. And Zeus and Hermes took on mortal bodies and began going house to house to see if they would be welcome. And house after house in Lystra closed the door on them and would not welcome these two Greek gods, the supreme gods of all the Greek pantheon, into their homes. It's fascinating that story, this archaeological evidence came out in the 2nd century AD. They also found further evidence that a Latin poet by the name of Ovid, who lived during the time of Jesus, actually told the same story of this visit. Zeus and Hermes walked along from house to house being rejected until they came to the house of an old lady. And the old lady opened her home and welcomed these two gods dressed as mortals into her home. They were so moved by the story of this legend goes, that they actually made her house into the temple that became the Temple of Lystra, and made all of her family priests. This is the story, if you will, that is in the minds of these people. When Paul walks up, God taps him on the shoulder and says, "Heal this guy." Can you imagine what's going through their mind? What's going through their mind is Paul and Barnabas are Zeus and Hermes, and they've come back a second time for a second visit, and I sure as heck am not going to make the same mistake that those people before me made. I'm going to welcome them, I'm going to worship them, we're going to slaughter animals on their behalf. And all the while, Paul and Barnabas have no idea what's going on because they do not understand the Greek language. And you can tell they've been going, okay, this is kind of getting weird, this is kind of getting weird, whispering, can you translate this for us? What's going on? Oh my gosh, they're worshiping us, Barnabas, this is not going exactly how we thought. Amazing to me how strong these taboos go. We are nothing like this. How often do you sit with somebody and they'll say something and they do this on their table? I'm amazed by this every time. The utter ridiculousness to me to tap on a wooden table to make sure that whatever you just said is not going to be cursed in any way. These are the crazy. I was watching TV the other night and this commercial came on. It was, I'm going to probably mess the website up, and I hope I do, because if any of you go to this website, spend money on this, I'm quitting. It was something like callepsychicfriend.com. For $1 an hour, you can call who knows who to make sure your future is all laid out before you. First of all, I don't want to know my future. Today is enough for me to handle. I don't even want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. If I even knew what was going to happen today, I might just go home and go back to bed sometimes, right? For $1, and they had all these testimonies of all these people that would share how this person just changed their life by predicting their future for $1 an hour, or excuse me, $1 a minute. I'm saying it wrong. $1 a minute. Wow. And what it says is they brought animals and garlands, their wreaths that they would lay over these oxen. And it says in verse 13 that they went to the gate. It could be the gate of the city. More than likely, they're at the gate of the temple structure for Zeus and Hermes, verse 14. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, which means the light bulb was going off, this is not good, they tore their robes, which is a sign that blasphemy is about to take place. And they rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things." Vain things is a translation of idols. But I love that term again. Why are you pursuing these things in life that will not ultimately give you purpose? To a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is within them. I think this is so cool again. Paul and Barnabas are not faced with a Jewish audience. This is not a group of people that have any sense of a single God, of one living God that created everything. They have no sense of the God of Israel over time in the Old Testament. And so they don't go there. You remember in the sermon last week we were looking at in chapter 13, they were in a synagogue. Paul summed up literally 2/3 of the Old Testament in 6 verses. You can do that with an audience that knows the same God you're talking about. He was just trying to get them to finish their thought out of, oh, by the way, Messiah is fulfilled. This group doesn't even know who one God is, let alone who this Messiah would be. And so Paul does not take that approach. He takes a completely different approach. He's so sensitive to his listeners. He adapts how he talks about God and the story, which I love. And he's trying to get them to turn away from these idols, these vain things, this pursuit of things that do not give us life. And they're completely against what we're told to do in the sacred story. The pursuit or worship of anything above and beyond God is totally wrong in the sacred scriptures. And it's really pointed out for at least 2 reasons. First of all, it's a diminishing of God. Anything that we create, whether it's finding purpose in our job or our bank account or whatever it is that kind of becomes an idolatrous thing for us, right? The time that we get to ourselves, whatever we put as preeminent that we think is going to ultimately give us the source of life, is diminishing God. What it's doing, it's taking God and actually molding him down to something we can get our hands around. God is not something we can get our hands around. God is not something we will ever fully comprehend until we stand before Him face to face. But there's a second thing that I'm always amazed at, a second reason that God is against this idea of pursuing idols or vain things in our life. And we're really the second reason. The way the Bible teaches this, particularly in the book of Genesis, is that God is one God, but He's three in one. He's the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And so before there is creation, there is the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, reacting to one another, loving one another, enjoying one another, relating with one another, doing all of the best things that exist in relationship. And the three of them are having such a great time together. One of them looks at the other and says, we got to do more of this. And that's the point of you and I. The three of them sit down and say, let's create humanity. And let's have them look like us, and act like us, and think like us. Let's make them actually a copy of us. The word is image. Let's make them an image of us. And then when people see each other, it will be a reflection like looking in the mirror and remind them of the three of us together. Now we know this doesn't work out perfectly because we all read the news this morning, right? We know the things that go on in life. But when this between you and I is going well, all we're doing is reflecting God. When we turn the focus away from God as the source of our life, and we start pursuing vain things, we're actually pursuing a copy of the copy. Does that make sense? And to God, a copy of the copy is too far removed to reflect Him. Only you and I, only mankind is a reflection of God. Nothing else in creation mirrors God or reflects God. And so the second reason I think, at least, that God is keeping us from worshiping idols is not just to make sure that He is not reduced, but I think He's actually making sure that we do not reduce our significant place in life. We were made to be sons and daughters of the living triune God, and to reflect Him to humanity. And to worship anything other than God is to actually reduce our role as well. Verse 16. In the generations gone by, the Apostle Paul is still giving this kind of mini sermon, if you will. In the generations gone by, God permitted all the nations to just go their own ways. And yet He did not leave Himself without witness, in that He did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Again, this is a page right out of Romans chapter 1. What is Paul doing? Again, he knows his audience does not have the same concept of a single triune God, if you will, that created everything. So Paul instead of turning to the Scriptures to tell the faithfulness of God's story, he turns to creation. He turns to empirical evidence. He says, go to Yosemite, people, and look at Half Dome and tell me that's an accident. He says, go have coffee with a trained physician and have them explain to you how the human body really works. When you talk, Brian and I, we work with physicians. I've never had a time where I've been with a physician where they have literally said to me, I know exactly how the body works. They know how things move, but they have no idea why they move. They don't know why they keep moving. It's miraculous that this thing keeps going, right? It's miraculous. Nobody understands it. And that is what Paul is saying to this audience. You have all of creation around you that is screaming to you that there's a God behind this, that is sophisticated and artistic, creative, and deeply loving to put this before you. I was in Montana a few weeks ago, duck hunting with Eric Sutherland and a little bit with Hap and Jason Parks. They used to go here for a long time. You know, freezing cold, it's 20 degrees out, snow everywhere, and we're all bundled up. And I've been doing this for several years now, ever since Eric moved there. And Eric and I are hunting with the same guy. We hired this guy. He's a guide. His name's David. He's 40. He's just salty as you can get, and we just love this guy. He starts his morning out with a nice concoction of rum and hot apple cider, and it's not a bad tasting thing. And he sits there and just drinks with us, but he's an incredible duck guide. And he knows Eric and I have an association with God. He knows that because that's just how Eric and I are. And we're not too brutal about it or pushy about it. But he knows we know each other through this place called church. He knows we have some kind of thoughts. But we're not too, we're not too overt with it. And we were talking about Duck Dynasty the other day. I saw Phil Robertson got in some trouble the other day, which I think is kind of funny for having an opinion. But that aside, and so we were talking about Duck Dynasty, and he just thinks the show's hilarious and on and on. He said, this cracks me up, he said, I actually went online and pulled up a couple of that guy's sermons. And Eric and I just about fell off our seats. Only Phil Robertson from Duck Dynasty, trust me, could get this rum and cider drinking 40-year-old to listen to a sermon. He said, in that sermon, Phil Robertson was talking about the beauty of creation. I mean, here's a guy, he's a duck and fishing guy. Every day he sits in the sandbox of God, right? I mean, wow, what an easy thing to point to. And then Phil Robertson started talking about time. 2013, 2012, 2010, 2000. And he went all the way back to the year 0, and he said, in the sermon, something crazy must have happened to change the whole clock. It was just something a Phil Robertson would say. And this salty, buzzed duck guide of ours looked at us and said, that's pretty hard to argue. That's what Paul is doing. He's pointing to creation, and his point is obvious. And boy, is this important for you and I. Do not get more enamored with the creation than you are with the creator behind it. When you interact with people, you'll hear this. They're so enamored with creation, but it never stopped for a moment to say, I wonder what's behind this. If creation is this fantastic, wow, what did it take to place this here? Verse 18. Even saying these things with difficulty, they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifices to them. But Jews came down from Pisidian Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul to an inch of his life and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. They didn't even have the dignity to drag him out first. They just did it Johnny on the spot. But while the disciples stood around him, he got up and entered the city, meaning he went right back in. The next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe. You can see how strong this opposition is to the gospel. This is a long way for these people to come from Pisidian Antioch. This is an over 100-mile journey from Pisidian Antioch to come all the way down to Lystra. Through the Tarsus Mountains. These are 4,000-foot elevation mountains. Snow-capped in the winter, hotter than blazes in the summer. This is beyond hatred. This is what I would refer to as coordinated. This is sophisticated. This is irrational. I would use the word diabolical. And the attack is all against Paul. And I think it's against Paul because he's the one God is using to put the chair back upright. He's the one God used to hire this lame guy. He's the one that called for these people to all abandon this pursuit of vain things to seek out the living God. When light hits dark, dark hates it. And we should find a huge warning in this and a huge comfort in this. Too often, we get lulled to sleep thinking that this world is neutral. This is not a neutral place. And by the way, it's not a neutral place with some good stuff and some bad stuff. Andy Lawrence was telling me they went and saw The Book Thief, and his comment was, it said it's a really good movie, but he said, every time I'm faced with just to have to stop for a moment to think about the Holocaust, I'm just sick inside. Right? These events in life, they're not just bad, they're so wickedly evil, they're beyond comprehension, right? Likewise, there are things in life where you think, no way should somebody have done this. And the good that pours out of them is so otherworldly, we go, wow. See, this isn't just good and bad in a neutral world. The Bible describes us as two kingdoms at complete odds with each other. The kingdom of this world and the kingdom of God. And we have to remember, every time we leave these doors and we see evil and pain and hurt, we should not be shocked by this. In fact, we should be really stunned when we see that good stuff pour out, because it's reminiscent that God's footprints are there still. God is still moving in our midst. And just a side note, it appears that Luke left out a little bit of detail. These believers in Lystra are caring for Paul. They clean him up, they take him back to their house at great risk to themselves. They don't care if other people see them take care of Paul, they do it anyway. And they eventually end up down in Derbe, another 60 miles to the southeast. Verse 21. After they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, is the translation, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Pisidian Antioch. Wow, is that guts? These are the people that came 100 miles down to stone him to an inch of his life, and he marches right back up there. This term, made many disciples, the literal translation is, they discipled many. This isn't just they're sharing Jesus with somebody and going away. That's like a hundredth of what they're doing. What this term means, they made many disciples, they discipled many. It means they went back to all the little churches that got established and they taught them the deep things of the Scriptures of God. They rooted them deeply in their faith. They mentored them, is what they did. And verse 22 is the example of this. Strengthening the souls of those disciples, encouraging them to continue in their faith, and saying, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And a couple side notes. The people that stoned Paul must think, okay, he's smart enough to not do this again, we can go home now. And Paul just jumps back up, dusts himself off, and goes right back through every one of these cities, sharing how deeply God loved them and training them in these deep thoughts. Paul returned to these churches at least 2 more times. It was so important to them to make sure that their faith was deep, that they understood the story in a deep way. And another side note, most scholars believe this is the moment when Paul wrote the letter to the Galatians. The Galatians were probably not a little church. The Galatians were a set of churches in the whole area of Galatia. The churches of Galatians are probably the church in Pisidian Antioch and Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. And when Paul writes this letter, he's writing to these little churches that got created out of these synagogues to encourage them and deepen their faith. Jerry Grossi just taught the book of Galatians upstairs in the journey class that meets at 9 o'clock. And part of what's happening is there's people that are trying to agitate the church and teach them false things. You can see the opposition. The same opposition that Paul is coming across is the same opposition that these churches are coming across. Verse 23. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, Paul and Barnabas commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. This flows right out of the previous 2 verses. Paul and Barnabas picked elders. They picked people that were gifted by God to teach and to train and to deepen their faith. I've mentioned this before, but this church is unique. You could go your whole life and you'll never see a church like this. And I'll say this because I have nothing to do with it. I've been in this church for 18 years. And for the last 12 months, 18 months, the elders were actually studying what is an elder, particularly out of the book of Acts. And an elder is really not somebody solving church issues. An elder is somebody that studies the Word and teaches and prays over the body. That's the role of an elder. And that group of guys, the humility, it's the greatest scene in my 50 years in life of humility I've ever seen in the church. Guys like John Paymer and Dale Larks, Mike Dunsing, if he's here this morning. I mean, crazy. Phil Herndon. Mike Sheedy, these guys looked at each other and said, you know what, my main gifting is not teaching. And so I'm not going to be referred to as an elder because that's not really my role. I have different roles of deaconing and leading this church. Those guys actually said, we're not the elders, we shouldn't be the elders, and this is not a hierarchy thing. That's what's beautiful about this. They said, we're going to step aside in this role because we need to be doing the roles we're doing. We need to be pouring out the gifting God has us to make sure this church is loved properly. And other guys like Jerry Grossi and Jeremy Mann and Derek Ewan stepped up and said, okay, these are the guys that are elders. These are the teachers. And they will teach us and ground us. That's what these churches did. Paul and Barnabas looked at these and they said, there's a supernatural gifting on a few of these guys. Let's make them the elders. Your role is just to teach and ground because tribulation is coming. Hard stuff is going to hit you, and you have to know what is happening when it's happening. And I've never seen anything like this. I think I shared this a month or so ago. My pastor was meeting with a guy in another church in the area, by the way. And this guy's church is in trouble, and they've got a senior pastor that isn't really gifted to teach, so of course he's teaching 80% of the time because he's the senior pastor, and that's what they do. Just this mishmash of church stuff. And he said, do we have any hope? And David Eckman looked at him and said, I've only seen one church in my entire life of pastoring that has gone through this transition well. It's Creekside and Allen. That is just crazy. So I say that out of just sheer joy and encouragement and lauding you men for the humility and the heart you have for God and the sense you have of yourself to know what God really does for you. And we all need this. We need to pattern ourselves after these guys. We need to have no ego in this. This is just God pouring himself out supernaturally through people, teaching and exhorting through the elders. Verse 24, they passed through Pisidian Antioch. Paul went right back there and came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went back down to Italia on the coast, that's the port, from where they sailed to Antioch of Syria, from which they had been commended by the grace of God for the work that they had accomplished on this first missionary journey. And when they had arrived and gathered, the church there in Syria, in Antioch of Syria, gathered together. And Paul and Barnabas began to report all the things that God had done with them, and to show how he had opened a door of faith with the Gentiles. And they spent a long time there with the disciples. Again, this is so cool. The whole church is involved in this. This isn't about two guys that went on a missionary journey. This is about whoever else was in that church that gave them maybe the money to go do this. This is about the rest of the people in the church that prayed for him while they went. This is about the people in the church that cared for each other while they were gone. And the other elders in that church, in the church of Antioch of Syria, that taught while they were away. There's no ego in this church whatsoever. They just are so enamored with God and with each other. They just want to love each other after their own giftedness and talents. That's all it was. No ego. No, I love it. People come up to me that have never been around here. They ask me this all the time. Are you the senior pastor? My answer is no, I'm not the senior pastor. I'm just a guy. God gave a gift to speak, and so I speak a bunch. That's it, like a bunch of other people. I'm not. I had somebody come up to me a few months ago. He said, when will you put the senior pastor in? And I'm thinking, boy, this was after my sermon. How cruddy was that sermon? And I didn't even understand his question. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when's the real guy showing up? Dude, I have no idea. He said, so this is temporary? I said, well, I suppose. I'm going to die sometime. Yeah, it's definitely temporary. I've been doing this for 3 years. I don't know. Tomorrow I can finish. 30 years I could be done. I have no idea. He did not. I've never seen him since, by the way. Did not know what to do with it. This is what I see in this church. Just no ego. And we got to protect this so much. Because the enemy, when the enemy sees light in darkness, the enemy hates it. Amen? Care for this. Watch over this. In a deep, deep way. I want to close with just a couple thoughts beyond that thought. And the first one is this. I'm struck by this. What possesses a guy like Paul? Do you ever just ask yourself this, if you know anything about the Apostle Paul? My wife and I spent 17 days in Turkey and Greece. The main thing I got out of it, and every day it got deeper, to the point where it choked me up. This guy's crazy. I mean, who does this? I mean, just the trip from Derbe to Lystra is 81 miles. From Lystra, Iconium, 21 miles. Iconium to Pisidian Antioch, another 100 miles. That's just a trip along the top that we saw to go back to the churches in the towns that stoned him to an inch of his life, by the way. That's crazy, with this 200 miles just so he could go back and meet with the people that gave their life to Jesus to make sure they were okay. Walking into the towns that tried to kill him. Going over 4,000-foot mountain passes covered in snow with one pair of sandals on his feet and a little knapsack over his shoulder. I mean, this isn't a bus. I was worn out after 17 days riding on a bus, for heaven's sake. There's times where I look at this guy and I go, God, I don't get this. I mean, we have to ask ourselves that question. I mean, do you have this deep of a sense of something in your life that carries you like this? Let me tell you what it isn't. This is not Paul waking up every day, pulling himself up by his obedient proverbial bootstraps and trying to do the right thing. That may last about a week. And then you wear out. This is a sense of gratitude that is so deep that nothing stops this guy. He literally pours his entire life out on behalf of other people and just dies. Who does this? And more importantly, why would somebody do this? What must have God done for this guy that he is that thankful that he just goes right back into a place that tried to kill him? Because he's got people there that love Jesus and they're confused and he has to help them. This is Christianity. I'm telling you, it ain't trying to do the right thing all day long. That's overrated. Now, should we do the right thing? Absolutely. Do we need to do the right thing? Absolutely. Here's how you do the right thing. You figure out what it is Paul has, and you'll do the right thing. You'll go home and treat your spouse right. You'll go home and treat your kids right. You'll treat your work people right, your friends right. A gratitude that runs this deep. I think Paul finished his day with a thought. I think Paul started his day with a thought. I think Paul closed his eyes and he'd see Jesus, that baby that showed up here, this God that would dare to dust himself and get down in the dirt with you and I, would allow himself to go on the cross to make sure Paul knew what Paul was worth it. And Paul never got over it. The second last little thought is the strengthening that these people get primarily comes from the unfolding story of God's faithfulness. If you're in the midst of stuff, and you know what I mean by that, or if you're not, you will be. What we need is a deep sense of the faithfulness of God over history. We need this. We need something that elevates us out of the muck and mire and confusion of the problem we're in and lets us know there's something bigger going on here. Amen? Dedicate yourself to knowing the faithfulness of God over time. And let it sink in deeply so that that gratitude, like Paul, will carry you every day to do the right thing. Let's pray. Father, this guy just almost seems otherworldly at times. And yet he's just like us. He's broken. He's lived life without you. He's mocked you. He's ignored you. And yet, he was clear enough at a moment and humble enough to realize that life only exists as it connects to you. Thank you, Father, for your Son. Thank you for what this season means to us. That you are willing to soil, in a sense, yourself by coming down amongst this ragamuffin group called mankind. And die for us so that we might know what our value is before you. We are worth dying for. May we see the majesty that resides in the birth of your Son. And we pray this in his name. We acknowledge that he is our King, and our Savior, and our Messiah. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.